What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Badlands, yet another emergency podcast. Connor here, and Paul is here. Will's got the recap up. Joe will be on the feed. It's the trilogy of the end of an era. The Jets move on. They part ways with Joe Douglas just a less than 2 months before his contract was set to expire. They get a head start on their GM search. A long, long tenure, especially for the Jets organization at the top for Joe Douglas, that ultimately ends in failure. Paul, what a day, man. It just feels like every other week someone's either being fired or some kind of chaos is brewing. And this to me is just kind of the rip the band-aid off moment, because they could have rode this out and left a little mystery, because obviously if Douglas was here, maybe Rodgers will be back. Doing this just less than 2 months out from his contract ending is just, okay, we're turning the page. This is going to be a new era. I don't think Rodgers is going to be here next year, and it didn't work, and it's time to move on.
Yeah, it's a clear signal, which I can appreciate as a fan. I think,
Right.
I was a little when they let Salah go, I was a little like, well, that's still kind of only half the job, right? So, I was upset at the time, thinking that like, okay, if we're going to do a teardown, why are we not getting a head start? Because as long as this person is around in the building as a lame duck, you can't really, in good faith and in the best form possible, start putting the pieces together for whatever comes next. So while it may be like a month late, I'm still glad that it happened in season. I think Joe Douglas is probably the first GM in NFL history to be hired in the summertime and fired in the fall. I'm not sure that's ever happened before. So he holds that.
Scoregani's version of GMs.
Exactly. So he holds that distinction. The other thing, like in the immediate aftermath here, and we're probably going to have to buckle up for a couple weeks of LOL Jet stuff by the national media. National media. It's not just going to be local for the next little while here. I find it a little interesting, I'll say, that the football establishment, like, gut immediate reaction to this is to dunk on the Jets and the
Of
ownership. And
course.
I think you sit here as a fan and you think to yourself, like, yeah, well, we know that, right? And that's fine. You're not breaking any news to us. But I think it's interesting how people are coming out and kind of defending Joe Douglas. And a lot of them are friends of Joe Douglas, like friends of Joe Douglas that we know are friends of Joe Douglas. And okay, is your job to be a good friend? Because you're being a really good friend, but I don't think you're telling the whole story. And I think it's a little disingenuous to come out there and point out all the good things that have happened and blame everything bad on ownership when we can point directly at a couple bad GM moves along the way that have contributed to this place. And at the end of the day, he was complicit in all this. At the end of the day, if you're the top football man, it's your job. It's part of your job to push back on forces, whether they be from the ownership group or the business side or wherever they're coming from. It's part of your job to push back on that and say, no, I'm the top football man here. This is what needs to happen. So I'll say that the reaction by the national media was revealing to me at a minimum. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing or that it's
Right.
wrong or that it's right. I think we all kind of lose the concept of multiple things being able to be true at the same time.
Yes.
And it's okay to have more than one thing be true at the same time, right? So I don't know, man. How are you feeling in the wake of all this?
Very similar. I think you opened up a really important door, and that's, you can't just always press the it's the Jets button. It's lazy. It doesn't cover a lot of the facts. The reality is, yeah, we all know it. Like, the Jets haven't had success with Woody owning the team since 2010. Nobody's arguing against that. And I wrote it as, there are multi-layered issues with the Jets that are a longer conversation for another day, and probably the reason that we're already brainstorming the docu series. But in a nutshell, in a vacuum, with Joe Douglas, there are so many football related moves that didn't work. I look at it like this: as somebody that, once upon a time, my dream in life was to be a GM of an NFL team, and I tried to look at it like this, or even my friends that are in the league that have that dream or had that dream, this is a great shot, like about as good as you can ask for. This is how I wrote it out. Joe Douglas got a 6-year deal, was paid millions and millions of dollars each of those years, which, it's not all just about the money. It's not all just about the contract. Obviously, there are things more important to people in life that are more fulfilling to them in life. He came here when Adam Gase was here, his friend. right? That was the big sell. It didn't work. He got to hire his own coach in Robert Saleh. He was given a chance to build it around Sam Darnold. That 2020 draft was a disaster. And then he was given the chance to move on from Sam, draft a quarterback with the second overall pick in the draft. That was a disaster. And then was given the option to press the veteran quarterback button to see if they could win that way with Aaron Rodgers, which did not work. It was a risk with a guy entering his 40s. It's how it goes with older quarterbacks. We all signed up for it because what else was there left to do at that point? You already missed a couple times. And then you get into the real nitty gritty things. And these are the things like the national media and other fans of other teams don't really realize, but we do, covering the ins and outs of this team all the time. The Becton pick spiraled out of control. You missed on Becton. You tried other veteran options. Those didn't work time and time again. You had to take Olu, who we all really like, but because you had to take Olu, you couldn't take a Bowers, which was a no-brainer. Great player. The safety has always been a problem on this roster every single year. The defensive line was always going to deal with turnover because guys get paid, you move money around, this and that. Some guys want to go test free agency. The lack of depth accumulated over the years made them a total house of cards this year. Jermaine Johnson gets hurt week 1. Hassan Reddick holds out. Also, terrible move by the GM. Hassan Reddick, awful move. Jermaine Johnson gets hurt. You now are playing Michael Clemens and Solomon Thomas at a wild amount of snaps, who are barely prepared to handle a rotational role because they struggled in that the year before. You signed Javon Kinlaw. You gave him over $7 million to play next to Quinnen Williams. He's been terrible. So all your moves in the front 7 for this year didn't work. While your back end is struggling, all you had is corners who have lost confidence because they're getting no help from the pass rush or their safeties. Not to give Sauce an out, but to give Sauce a little bit of an out. He has lost confidence because of all the issues around him. And he has to take accountability for that, but it's also they have set him up to fail at times this year as well. And now the long term, he's not here. Guess what fucking is? Dead money for multiple years. Like the guy's out the building, but all his problems, a lot of his problems are still here. Dead money this year for the likes of a great cast of characters such as Laken Tomlinson, Carl Lawson, Dwayne Brown, McCole Hardman. I could keep going, but I'm not going to. Dead money next year, just to name a couple. Hassan Reddick, Alan Lazard, Tyron Smith. Like, I don't want to just pile on Joe Douglas because he just got fired. But I think it needs to be said, these are the reasons why he was given an incredible chance in 6 years, and the majority of his most important moves didn't work. And that's it. I'm not sitting here, I'm not hating Joe Douglas. I'm not angry at Joe Douglas. He got his shot. It was a damn good one. He was paid really well for it, and he missed time and time again at some of the most key spots of a general manager. Hiring the coaches, getting the quarterback, and building the offensive line and pass rush. If I sat in a meeting and somebody asked me what are the most important things as a GM, it's probably the 4 things. Honestly, those are probably the 4 things. And he was really bad at addressing all of them. So it's a shame. All of us wanted it to work. Nobody wanted to be in this era this long, but it was not. You could not run this back. Yeah, you just had to do this, unfortunately.
100%. And that's the story as you laid it out chronologically there perfectly. Like, I hope we clip that and put that chronological order out there because that's a great way to sum it up. And like you said, that's the story is it didn't work. And you're hearing a lot of Jet fans defending the guy. And I said it on my pod with Jake this week that, like, I understand it. Like, I genuinely do understand it because he does seem like a likable guy. There were some nice moves to point to. And part of it, I think, is a sickness in the fan base of just wanting so badly to cling on to anything that you view as a little bit good because we've been so starved to have long-term good and big good, right? And so what you're hearing is people saying things like, oh, well, Mekhi Becton is playing well in Philly. And it's like, well, is he? But why didn't it work? If that's the case, right, which I don't even know if I'm willing to agree to that, but if that's the case, why didn't it work here? As the head football man in charge, you're in charge of not only making the picks, but then making sure that there's a plan and
Right.
making sure that the plan works here. And it never felt like there was a plan. You brought up safety. Everybody wanted to see Jordan Whitehead go, but he goes, and then there's no plan. It's just, well, wait for Chuck Clark, right? And that plan wasn't good enough. And Chuck Clark got hurt again. And Tony Adams is not that good. And there was no plan at edge when you let Bryce Huff walk. And there was no plan on the interior when you traded JFM. And so I think in a lot of ways, the things that people are defending Joe Douglas for and saying that he did some good things and he's the right guy for the job and we can't just keep cycling through executives and ownership is the problem. Okay, you're right. But I think The real ending to that story is that's why he got 6 years. All those little breadcrumbs of good,
Right.
that's why he was here as long as he was. But that doesn't turn into 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? At some point, that leash ends and you have to cut ties and you have to start over again. And it's not the ending anybody wanted, but it is where we are. At the end of the day, it's a 30-64 record. And at some point, you have to move on and say, this did not work.
Right. Right. I think if I had 100 Jet fans in front of me and I had a way to project to them like really one more most important question on this whole topic, I'd be like, do you trust him to take the next quarterback and hire the next coaching staff? And how can you say yes? Like how with a straight face, with everything this franchise has gone through over the last half decade, how could you literally sit there and say yes? Is it because the bar was set so low by John Idzik and Mike McCagnon that you have this Stockholm syndrome of, well, I've seen it, really, really bad before. So I think this is a little better, which I know there's a debate on that. Like, is this even better than that era? So yeah,
But it's that fear that lives in all Jets fans of, will the next thing be worse? Will we be
right.
subjected to more
Yeah,
pain next
yeah.
time than we got
More
this time?
embarrassment. Right.
Yep.
Yeah, that's fair. It really is. I think that's unfortunately a lot of the fan base, and it's to no fault of their own, have developed not this losing mindset, but they have really forgotten what things were like with a normal functioning football organization in terms of wins and losses. And I to be fair, I saw a lot of fans point out today he accumulated talent, which is really fair. Like people are like, why are you piling on like Joe Douglas? Stay was fired. Like this is why he was fired. If we want to give compliments to Joe Douglas, like he did accumulate some talent,
He did.
but they didn't build a team. You never knew what the Jets were. Oh, you have this great running back in Breece Hall and this great wide receiver in Garrett Wilson. What do we want to be? We don't know what we want to be. Sometimes we come into the game, and we feel like we can get outside zone going with Breece, and then something goes wrong and we panic and we're spiraling out of control. It felt like 2023 was the most sure I've ever been of their identity with any aspect of football, and that was the defense. I felt like the front four was stout enough, not great, but good enough against the run to get teams in third and longs, and they had a great pass rush package and coverage on the back end to get off the field. I knew Bryce Huff, Jermaine Johnson, Quinton Williams, Quentin Jefferson could force the quarterback to have to get the ball out, and Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, Michael Carter, Brandon Eccles, Jordan Whitehead, guys in the secondary would survive with that time because the pass rusher get home and those guys are good in coverage. That was the Jets' identity. A furious front four that could rush the passer and good coverage on the back end where they got stop after stop after stop. The 2024 New York Jets have taken 10 steps backwards on all of that. They don't stop the run. They're losing confidence in coverage. They don't take away the football. And once again, there is no offensive identity. The offensive identity is Aaron Rodgers gets to the line of scrimmage, tries to sniff out the defense, and gets the ball out within 4 or 5 yards down the field, and things really don't go anywhere. So the next GM, and these are going to be long conversations, but the Jets need to look for somebody that knows what this team wants to be. If they want to replicate the style of football, the Detroit Lions, you're going to hear all the peak examples, right? The Lions, smash mouth football team. They run the ball. They stop the run. The quarterback plays a clean game. Or are we going to look for a mobile quarterback and we want to be an offense that can threaten the edges, but also improvise and try to push the ball down the field in spots like the Ravens with Lamar Jackson, the Bills with Josh Allen. Those guys are hard to find, but even a Jaden Daniels in Washington has that kind of skill set. They really just need to figure out how are we going to build this team. And I think my sense is the Jets won't just force a quarterback pick in this spot. I think they want to build an infrastructure in place for a young guy to actually succeed, because every time they've done it the other way, those young guys can't come in and uplift this organization. And it's a brutal spot to put them in. And the reality is Aaron Rodgers at 40 and 41 years old, he couldn't even come in and lift up this organization. So the Jets always get away from what they did last, right? Like when you look at the hiring history, they always change exactly the demeanor of the coach, the style of the coach, the demeanor of the GM, the style, football guy, cap guy, scouting guy. And like Douglas once upon a time was billed as a new age analytical mind on top of scouting mind. I'm fascinated to see what the pivot is now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like when you take everything that you just said there together, Connor, I think the what spits out the other side of that machine is he's not a GM, he's a scout. And that's okay, right?
That's a
And maybe
common
he wasn't
problem.
ready for this opportunity.
Right.
And maybe he will have success down the road. And I hope he does. And I hope he learns something. And maybe he goes back and works for the Ravens or the Eagles and he gets some more experience and he gets another shot down the road. But all those things you said together, he can evaluate talent, he can bring it in, but there is no identity. That is part of his job, right? When you hire a general contractor to build a house, that's great if they can source all the best materials and bring all the good appliances in,
Right.
right? But if he just dumps it on the doorstep and says, I don't know what to do now, I don't know how this all goes together, I don't know how to build the electrical, and maybe it was a staffing problem. Maybe, like you and Joe have been saying, there weren't enough bodies in the building to put that plan together. But at the end of the day, that is part of his job. And so while he did do some good things and while he is a good talent evaluator, part of your job as a GM is to make that plan and to cobble it all together and to make sure it fits and to work with the coaching staff to say, hey, if I bring in this guy, are you going to be able to make this work in your scheme? Or would we be better served going and finding another player who may not be as talented, but might be a better fit for the structure we're trying to put together here, right? And so at the end of the day, that might be the piece that was missing for Joe Douglas was, hey, he can do a lot of things really well, but maybe he just wasn't ready to be a GM in the NFL, and maybe he will be someday. Like I said, I hope he is, but it wasn't working here. And so at some point, you just have to come to terms with that.
I think that's exactly it. I think, and I know this for a fact, the Jets just didn't have processes in place. It felt like when Douglas got there with optimism and his staff and his right hand guys, Chad Alexander, Rex Hogan, and the scouting department beneath them, they had a process that was, somewhat of a collective group. And then when things went wrong, what I had heard was Douglas had shut out a lot of the scouting department and coaches, and it became a little bit more of a tighter nucleus. And as trust was lost in the wider department, it became so much of a not a one man job, but it didn't feel like a collective effort as an organization. Of our guys scouting in the Pacific Northwest, like we know he's going to find us this, and this guy's going to find us that. It became that they were just selecting players and not really building and not building with the coaches. And ultimately, once you lose trust in a front office within the organization, you lose your processes. And the Jets have not had the right processes for a while now. And that's how they end up with, like, if anyone listening out there doesn't understand what I'm saying, let me paint the picture with one name: Malachi Corley. How do you trade up to 65 to take a guy that you leaked that you had him rated over wide receivers that were anyone with half a brain would tell you we're better than him? But that's once again another combo, not to get away from the point. You have no plan for this guy. And that's that is the point of not having processes. You can't sit here and tell me that the Jets as an organization wanted that one guy when they have no plan for such a specific skill set of a player. That's an example of just taking a player, dropping him on the chessboard and be like, let's see what happens. That's insanity. That doesn't work in the NFL. It's too difficult. The competition level's too high. The work ethic needed is too high. You need a plan. You need help. You need answers. It's way too difficult of a league to try to survive like that. And that's kind of a microcosm of their entire problems right now. So if you have anything left, Paul, empty the bag. We are going to spend a lot of weeks on this. The Jets GM search will begin. Their coaching search will begin. I'm fascinated to see the infrastructure of this organization, especially assuming that Woody is going to be out, leaving overseas eventually. It's just getting started right now.
Yeah, I think you put it really well, right? And maybe like the general public doesn't realize what encompasses in the GM job. It's not just signing free agents. It's not just drafting players. It's not just making trades. And while he didn't do particularly well on any of those three
Right.
fronts, there were like one or two in each bucket that you can point to and say that was a good move. But it's deeper than that. Like you said, it's not just taking athletes and dropping them on the coaching staff and saying, figure it out, right? It's a cohesive process to all work together and to build the infrastructure and to make sure that you ask the ownership group for the bodies that you need to build out the processes that you want to see manifested, right? And I think that's the difference between good organizations and bad organizations is that there's a man in charge who's willing to have those difficult conversations and push for the resources that are needed to make those things happen. And the last thing I'll say too is you started your timeline off with the Mekhi Becton draft pick. I think you could even go back further and go to Ryan Khalil as the first swing and a miss on the offensive line. But it's funny, I had the meme in my head of like the guy pushing the small domino that leads to the big domino at the end. And like you can make the case that the Mekhi Becton pick, as you laid out, because it spiraled and it led to other areas, like you push over the first domino, that's drafting Mekhi Becton over Trifton Wirfs. And then like the last domino is like Aaron Rodgers 3-8, right? Like that has kind of led to all of this
Yeah.
because it made them constantly having to try to steal from Peter to pay Paul over here to try
Right.
to fix the mistakes of the past and not being able to draft a guy like Bowers because your team wasn't ready to insert that kind of piece because you still had foundational problems. And so I think it's really interesting to look back at that move as like that's kind of the one that set us on the trajectory that we're on now.
It's the leaks on multiple sides of the boat kind of situation where, you miss on one thing and then you sprint across the boat to try to patch a leak somewhere else and you're taking on water on the other side. And eventually your entire boat is submerged. Like that's what happened with the Jets here at multiple key areas. They were never able to recover despite being given real opportunity to try to patch mistakes, which is a dream for anybody working in the NFL, coach, GM, to have that time given by an owner. It's like yes, there are multi-layered issues with the Jets, but one thing people cannot say is Woody Johnson did not give Joe Douglas time. That we sat and waited for this to get better for a really, really long time. And unfortunately, it just didn't work out. All right. Thank you, everyone that's listening to this, because I know I see the comments and I feel everyone that's like, man, I'm just burnt out by it. I'm depressed by the Jets. I can't do this again. I can't go through another rebuild. So if you're still here, you're still listening to Badlands, we really, really appreciate you. Like we said, there's going to be a lot more coming on the feed. I know Joe's going to have something working. We'll have plenty of content even throughout the bye. So, Paul, I appreciate you joining me, man. And I'm sure we'll talk to everyone soon when the next bit of news pops up, as it always does.
Thanks for having me. See you soon.